is absolutely blown. I'm like thrilled to hear this, and especially looking forward to having more and more of this technology implemented in healthcare and in medical education worldwide. Next up in our program, we have another award-winning global thought leader, an international speaker on disruption and success, and an author of several notable books. And everyone from governments to consulting firms want him to join their events, but he is here with us today at Upgraded Life Festival 2018. Please welcome on stage Mr. Scott Amyx.
What you're seeing is a portrait or painting from the Belle Epoque period. It's also called the Beautiful Era period from 1871 to 1914, before the start of World War I. And it was a period that was marked with incredible high degree of economic prosperity, and it was the zenith of technological and scientific innovations. And it was during this time that Eiffel Tower, for example, was created and launched for the grand entrance to the 1889 World's Fair in Paris. In 1900, welcomed the Exposition Universelle in Paris that showcased the city's updated architecture to housing, street layouts, and green spaces. And I do emphasize green spaces again. And again, this was a period that was ushered by high-end technological advances, from automobiles, scooters, mopeds, to electric lights, to even cinematography and motion picture. And it wasn't just the arts. It was actually also sciences, whether it's Louis Pasteur with bacteriology, or the Nobel Prize winner Marie Curie that has developed the theory of radioactivity and techniques for isolating radioactive isotopes and discovery of new elements. So similarly, as Dr. Ahmed shared just a few minutes ago, we are in the midst of another golden age called the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And it is very much like the list that you saw, things like AI, machine learning, but also blockchain. The topic that I want to talk about today is around artificial intelligence. I don't cover as much of the blockchain, but I do want to let you know that those two actually go hand in hand. And there's a colleague of mine named Yanni from MIT, the founder vendor that is creating a consortium or alliance around blockchain and AI. And that will become very important as you look to use AI in the context of GDPR. Now, when we talk about these exponential technologies, it is not just one singular technology, but rather it's the convergence of technologies that works together. So in the case of the prior session around virtual reality needs a number of things. 5G was referenced as an example. It also requires wearables. So eventually HoloLens, and I have a startup out of Czech Republic that has 5K high dimension VR glasses as well. So it is a convergence of lots of different exponential technologies that helps accelerate the pace of that innovation. Now, narrow or weak AI is really what we're talking about when we were referring to artificial intelligence or the discipline of machine learning. And you can see that it's very much actually prevalent across industries and sectors, as you can see. So what I wanted to do today is to share with you just a few case studies on how AI is changing healthcare and wellness. Now, please keep in mind, I come from more of the technology background and less of the healthcare, so please bear with me as I cover some of these topics that are really not really my domain, but I'll try my best. For those of you that have been reading up on Crispr, raise your hand if you've been following up on some of the patent fights around Crispr. Yes. There's a reason why there is a economically driven fight behind some of these patents that's originating from UC Berkeley, MIT, and Harvard around CRISPR IP. As one of the UC Hastings law professors said, it's not an exaggeration to say that CRISPR may be one of the most important life science inventions in this era, And it truly is a gold mine. When you think about what it can do in terms of genome editing and the ability to be able to actually change fundamental DNA that can help reduce illness and prevent attacks from viruses and bacteria. Now, in short, CRISPR, which stands for cluster regularly interspaced short palindromic repeats, is really referring to the ability to edit genomes. It allows researchers to easily alter the DNA sequence and modify those gene function. It can be used to correct genetic defects, prevent the spread of diseases, or be able to improve crops, which is very interesting because most of us are eschewing GMOs, but in effect, there could be some benefits that could come out of this. Now, the protein Cas9, or CRISPR-associated, is an enzyme that acts like a pair of molecular scissors capable of cutting strands of DNA, as you can see here. And in the case of bacteria, the spacers are taken from viruses that were previously attacked an organism. And what it does is serves as a bank of memories, which then enables the bacteria to recognize the viruses and then fight off future attacks. For instance, in the case of Streptococcus thermophilus bacteria, as an example, which is a very commonly found bacteria in yogurt and milk cultures or dairy cultures, researchers can observe after a virus attack, new spacers were incorporated into the CRISPR region. Now, the DNA sequence of these spacers are identical to the parts of the virus genome. And by manipulating the spacers in a new viral DNA sequence, researchers can alter the bacteria's resistance to an attack by a specific virus, and thus strengthening the bacterial immunity. Now, where is this going in terms of AI? There is something called off-targets, which I'll try and explain a little bit, is that in the process of cutting some of these pieces and gluing some of these parts back, the problem is that it tends to introduce errors where the nucleotides are accidentally inserted or deleted, which then results in mutation. That is something that perhaps was not intended. So making incorrect edits in the DNA, as you can imagine, is a major issue that the community is trying to resolve. Now, CRISPR, as mentioned, has two components, a cutting component, or Cas9, and a guide, or gRNA, that directs it to the parts of the genome that you want to cut. Now, the gRNA is typically about 20 letters long, as you can see up there. The problem is that multiple sites in a genome can have the same series of letters. So CRISPR can end up cutting the wrong section, and this is referred to as off-target effect. Now, the issue with off-target effect is making incorrect cuts in a genome that could then switch on potentially cancer-causing gene. So this is highly problematic. So one of the ways that they're trying to figure out is how do they start to use AI in a way to be able to actually reduce these unintended consequences. So let me introduce you to some of you that perhaps may already be familiar and others that are less familiar. This is a tool from Microsoft called Elevation. This is a machine learning system that allows for researchers to enter a gene that they want to be able to modify and then get an estimate as to how bad that potential off-target effect is going to be. And it's a way to calculate in a way that provides which guide is going to least likely to result in that off-target effects for a particular gene. Now, what they do is they actually use quite a bit of publicly available information in addition to their proprietary data to be able to train their machine learning systems. So that was around CRISPR. But let me transition to talk to you about medical imaging. One of the biggest areas that we're starting to see AI impact right now is around visual pattern recognition. And it cuts across radiology, pathology, dermatology, ophthalmology. Today, even the best experts in the field may make a false positive diagnosis. And there's a study that says 50 to 63% of US women who are checked for regular mammograms over the course of 10 years will have at least one false positive that could lead to completely incorrect diagnosis, requiring potentially more testing, or in some cases something more invasive in terms of surgeries. That's troubling because the issue is that sometimes there is a degree of subjectivity. Matter of fact, 1/3 of the time, 2 or more radiologists will look at the same set of images and will essentially disagree and have different interpretation. Let's take a look at tumors as an example. With AI, it's able to increase the efficacy or the efficiency and the accuracy by 5 to 10% versus the average, let's say, a physician or a trained radiologist. And it's able to crunch through tens of thousands of records, if not potentially millions of records, in the course of hours, instead of days or weeks for humans. Now, some of the concerns, which unfortunately I didn't have enough time to address here, is around what happens as some of these machines take away some of the specialized capabilities. Are we potentially displacing radiologists, as an example, down the road? Now, as of last year, 2017, there were more than 40 AI startups in the $30 billion medical diagnostic market. Now, I'm going to go through just a couple of startups with you, just to give you a little bit more concreteness. One is called Voxel Cloud, coronary CTA. And what it does is it automates the image recognition and provides diagnosis through the use of AI. And the way it does that is, it sources data from about 100 hospitals in the US as well as in China, and it has about 16 million patient records. And it's really a general purpose AI that is able to diagnose across different types of diseases, whether it's lung cancer, diabetes, heart disease, liver disease, and so forth. But the key is that it's crunching through all that data. Now, one of the things that I think is important, especially in the context of EC and EU, is how do we do this in a way that's compliant with GDPR that's recently has become effective as of the 25th. Another startup is called Viz, which is a startup based out of San Francisco. And what it does is it's able to identify early potential indications of strokes in brain scans using machine learning. Now, strokes is the number 4 leading cause of death in the US. And it's one of the reasons why, unfortunately, so many people die is because they're not able to diagnose it early enough. So with a human neurologist, they're going to be able to potentially miss the smallest minute clues. But with their AI algorithm, they're able to compare and detect against a large data set of records to be able to quickly and more accurately detect early signs of stroke so that you can actually do something about it before it becomes deadly. Let's move on to cancer. To test for cancer, of course, we typically have to get a biopsy or some sort of surgery to remove perhaps a diseased tissue. And what you're seeing here is a tissue block. So pathologists typically have to slice these tissue blocks into very thin layers that then they examine under a microscope to see if it's cancerous. Well, the process is starting to utilize AI. So there is a startup called Paige AI here. That is able to access about 25 million pathology slides. And it applies deep learning to accelerate that decision support so that they're able to detect diseases more accurately and faster. Now, what they've developed is a proprietary slide viewer that is Microsoft vendor agnostic and is device independent, which is very important for hospitals and medical facilities. And this AI is able to crunch through lots of data, all these slides, to be able to compare against its growing database for rapid diagnosis. Another startup, disease prediction. So the ability to predict disease before it happens. And this is so important because we know that when it comes to economic saving. This is where prevention is so important. We have a startup called Prognosis. It's a New York City-based startup that uses AI against about 15 billion medical records, or about 180 million people in over 50 disease categories, from asthma, lung cancer, to rare diseases. And what it does is it analyzes clinical, lab, and diagnostic results and makes predictions about the patient's risk for a particular disease, and identifies those early enough, especially those high risk, so that you can actually respond to it appropriately. Moving on to another use case, which is the Icu Transfer. Many of you probably have heard about this case study from Permanente Medical Group. Their research department wanted to solve a particular problem, which has to do with patients coming in and out of ICUs. And what they realized is that some patients that receive these intensive care for a particular acute event and then return to their prior health status, and 3 to 4 times they're more likely to die than if a doctor had intervened and prevented the deterioration in the first place. So they looked across about 650,000 hospitalized patients, of which 20,000 require this type of ICU transfer. What their system, or their AI machine, does is it's continuously monitoring the health of these hospitalized patients. And they've created this predictive analytic model to identify which of these hospitalized patients are most likely to end up in the ICU tomorrow. So it's very near term. And they've set up notifications that are triggered when the system indicates that potentially this patient is at risk. And this extra notification gives them that one step early prevention that would have potentially, if left unchecked, would have led to a serious deterioration in clinical status that required transfer to ICU. This predictive power, as you can see, is saving hundreds of lives each year. So let's talk a little bit about just AI first. AI in the context of your work, your research, where does AI shine the most? Well, if you need to do descriptive or prescriptive analysis to clinical diagnostic data to improve and to accelerate decision support, that's definitely a candidate. Or you need to be able to crunch through hundreds of thousands or potentially millions of records to look for pattern recognition. That's another candidate for AI. Or you need to do some complex modeling that just frankly is too time-consuming, too tedious, or too complex. And finally, it's about if you're looking to improve the accuracy and speed in the smallest details. But in order for AI to be successful, it does need a few things. As you can see or heard from some of the case studies I shared with you, it's all about data. The technique, the methodology, they're there, and they're always advancing. But without the data, you can't train the systems. And it's not just about volume of data, but it's about variety of data and the velocity of data as well. And ultimately, where it really increases the efficacy is when the neural nets and the deep learning are able to use the data itself to be able to find the best fit coefficients. So as you think about how you apply AI in your respective fields and use cases, there's a great study that came out last year from the MITRE Corporation on AI for health and healthcare. And briefly, it outlines some of the areas of opportunities, like I mentioned before, health diagnostics, right? Using AI, such as medical imaging and other computationally advanced types of analysis in the clinical practice, and particularly non-invasive. Now, it also addresses data collection, as well as analysis and privacy matters, which is becoming hugely important. And it also looks at novel things, such as crowdsourcing, competitions, and citizen science, as well as unsupervised deep learning. So let me go over just a few points of recommendations for the study. One is to support that rigorous approval procedure needed to get into an acceptance for clinical practice, which is very important because what's acceptable in consumer market is not acceptable in the space that you're in. So making sure that you have ways to create testing and validation approaches for these AI algorithms. Because one of the biggest challenges, sometimes they work in a black box. You don't really know exactly how to derive that result. And making sure that it can actually work under different conditions, including training off different training sets. The other part is in regards to the confluence of AI and smart devices, such as eventually all the VR, AR glasses, as an example, is going to capture physiological data sets, as well as your eye tracking movements and so forth. So we want to be able to capture this and do it in a way that enhances the performance of some of these AI applications. In addition to that, we have to build a data infrastructure to capture and to integrate the data generated from these devices and wearables to support these AI applications. And of course, all in the context of privacy and transparency, as we thought through. Then we need to move on to creating comprehensive training databases of health data for AI development. And as an organization, it's so important to support the development of and the access to research databases of labeled and unlabeled health data, and to support the efforts to incentivize the sharing of health data with each other so that you can actually start to train some of these algorithms. And also having a higher threshold, making sure that it supports assessment of AI algorithms trained with data labeled at levels that are significantly exceeding in standard, such as the use of outputs from the next stage of diagnostics. In addition to identifying and developing strategies to address important data gaps for health. Data gaps is a big issue, as well as data integration. And finally, understand the importance of the limitations of AI. AI isn't going to solve all problems. It's not a magic bullet. And it requires supporting the development of crucial safeguards, like I mentioned before, so that you have a way to be able to have transparency in the processes and the methodology, and to be able to actually reproduce the large-scale computational models. And you need to be able to safeguard it against potentially misinformation, which is very dangerous. And this is the case of something that I have responded to on malicious AI that came out of Oxford not too long ago. And lastly, support the engagement of learned bodies to encourage and share best practices for deployment of AI application in health. So with that, I want to thank you for your time today and see if there are any questions.